Hey everyone, it's Dr. Matt Munger, and this is The Bible Was Written Backwards. Today, I want to talk about something that's been an interest of mine for a number of years, at least 15 years, I think, since I started working on linguistics and Semitics at the University of Oslo, and that is biblical law. Now, I know it sounds strange to think about biblical law in the terms of language and linguistics, but it really came out of one of the first major works I read in Akkadian when I was studying back in the day, the Laws of Hammurabi. And that really introduced me to the ways in which the biblical law also relates to the ancient Near East and the law codes that were in existence long before the Bible was written. So what I want to do is do actually a three-part series on the law as it is in the Bible. And the reason I want to do it like this is because there's so many aspects of the law that relate to the idea of the Bible being written backwards. So this first video, what I want to do is talk about the way the Bible is rewriting itself. So what we have in the biblical record is actually three law codes that show development from different stages, different contexts. And that's what we're going to look at in this first video. In my second video, which will come in a few weeks, we're going to be looking at the relationship between these biblical laws and some of the other Mesopotamian law codes, especially the Code of Hammurabi, which is probably the most famous law code in the ancient Near East. Finally, in the third video, we're going to look at the way suzerain and vassal treaties from the ancient Near East can be used to help us understand how the book of Deuteronomy especially, but all the law codes actually of the Pentateuch are formed in the way they are. So we're starting the series by looking at an overview of the law codes in the Pentateuch, and I'm going to show you how these were rewritten and adapted to new times and new situations. And they don't even come in the right order in the Pentateuch, but they come in a different order that's been put to fit the narrative of the story of the people of Israel wandering from Egypt all the way to Canaan. But these law codes actually develop in a different order than how we find them. So the basic idea that I want to look at today is that there are three sets of laws that all are basically representing a similar law code, but that develop into larger and more complex laws as time goes by. These three are generally called the Covenant Code, which is found in Exodus 20 to 23, the Priestly Code, which is found throughout Leviticus and Numbers, and there's then kind of a special part of this called the Holiness Code in Leviticus 17 to 26, which is especially important. And then we have the Deuteronomic Code, which is found in, shockingly, Deuteronomy, chapters 12 to 26. Now, these three portions of the Pentateuch contain not only different versions of the law, but also are imagined in the text as being different places in the narrative. So the Covenant Code in Exodus 20 to 23 is imagined as being given at the top of the mountain, directly after the giving of the Ten Commandments. The priestly laws, however, are imagined as being given from the tent of meeting and in other places, at the base of the mountain or throughout the travels. The Deuteronomic Code is part of the narrative that places Moses and the Israelites on the shore, the eastern shore of the Jordan River, just before entry into Canaan. So we're going to look at two examples of how laws developed between law codes in detail. The first one is a much more well-known law, or set of laws, which is the Ten Commandments, which is found in two places. And then we're going to look at the festival calendar, which is found in all three law codes. So basically what we're going to do is see how things are reused and adapted into new contexts already in the Pentateuch. But first, I want to give some examples of how these closely related texts do relate to each other, but also differ. So let's look at laws concerning where to build altars. Deuteronomy 12, 13 to 14 says, "Take care that you do not offer burnt offerings at any place you happen to see, but only at the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer burnt offerings, and there you shall do everything I command you." This is, of course, a clear prohibition against building altars anywhere other than the one place, which is, of course, the temple in Jerusalem. However, when we read Exodus 20, 24 to 26, we see a contradiction. It says, You will need to make for me only an altar of earth and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your offerings of well-being, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. So, in other words, Exodus tells the Israelites to build altars wherever and whenever and make sacrifices there, whereas Deuteronomy explicitly forbids this and demands that all worship be done in one place. Now, this is one of the most recognizable and impressive features of the book of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomic law, which is the centralization of the worship of God. So Deuteronomy wants everything to be done at the temple in Jerusalem. Another example of the differences between these texts is the release of a Hebrew slave, which is regulated in all three texts. So in Exodus 21, we read, "When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but the seventh he shall go free as a free person without debt." This is very similar to what we find in Deuteronomy 15. "If a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for you 6 years, the seventh year you shall set that person free." Now, when we read Leviticus 25:40, it states that they should only be released in the year of the Jubilee, every 49 years. So if any who are dependent on you become impoverished, that they sell themselves to you, you shall not make them serve as slaves. They shall remain with you as hired or bound laborers. They shall serve with you until the year of the Jubilee. Now, again, we see a development here from the texts of Deuteronomy and Exodus in several ways. Notice that this is only the regulations for Hebrew slaves and not for foreigners, who a little later in Exodus are discussed, who, and of course, can be passed down as inheritance, and the text literally says you should treat them like slaves. Now, on to our two major examples. First is the Ten Commandments, which a lot of people probably already know can be found in two different versions in the Bible. The first is in Exodus 20, and the second in Deuteronomy 5. Now, as we look at the parallel text here, it's pretty obvious that they're basically the same thing. I've made a nice little comparison here that I'll have on the screen, and we can look at that throughout this discussion. Now, there are only a few places where there is any difference at all, and thus it is clear that there is a literary dependence on these texts. But the fact that there are differences at all is worth looking at more closely. The differences are mostly small, with the phrase, "as the Lord your God has commanded you," appearing a few times in the text of Deuteronomy, whereas absent in Exodus. There is also small differences about the livestock that is to work on the Sabbath, but the main difference is the justification of the Sabbath commandment. As we see here, the text of Exodus references creation in its justification for the commandment by saying, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea and all that it is them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and consecrated it." Deuteronomy, on the other hand, justifies this commandment by referencing the Exodus. "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath." Now, this is a subtle difference, but shows that the texts have received different forms in the context where they are found. It is worth mentioning here that the different texts of the Ten Commandments has been an issue since antiquity. We even have a great manuscript that shows how at least one ancient scribe tried to deal with this in the time of the Dead Sea Scroll. The manuscript known as 4Q41, 4Q Deuteronomy N, is also called All Souls Deuteronomy, is a manuscript that contains the text of the Ten Commandments from Deuteronomy, but with several changes that smooth out the text to bring it in line with Exodus. In other words, the scribe actively edits the text of Deuteronomy in copying the Ten Commandments to provide a text which bridges the two texts. The second example I want to walk through in this video is a bit more detailed. We will be looking at the festival calendar that is found in 3 different places in the Pentateuch. The festival calendar is the prescriptions found in the text for when and how the Israelites are to celebrate the great religious festivals. So we're going to look at one text from each law code, one from Exodus 23, from Leviticus 23, and then from Deuteronomy 16. So first, let's look at the beginning of the law code as it is given in Exodus. It says, 3 times in the year you shall hold a festival for me. You shall observe the festival of unleavened bread, as I commanded you. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall observe the festival of the harvest, of the fruits, first fruits of your labor, of what you sow in the field. You shall observe the festival of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field the fruit of your labor. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my festival remain until the morning. The choicest of your first fruits of your ground you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Now, it's very clear that the text here is regulating 3 festivals. First, in the month of Abib, there is the festival of the unleavened bread. Then comes the festival of the harvest, and then the festival of the ingathering at the end of the year. 2 of these festivals are very clearly in the text related to harvest and agriculture. And if we look at the further prescriptions for this festival of unleavened bread in Exodus 34, we see it is also related to the birth of lambs and the sacrifice of the firstborn. So we can say that the festival calendar in Exodus 23 reflects an agricultural calendar and the yearly cycles without specifically saying when exactly these are to be celebrated. So we have a month name given here, Abib, but the rest of it has to do with the harvest. Now, the only stipulation of how to celebrate has to do with not eating leaven. Now, let's look at this parallel passage, or the development of this in the book of Deuteronomy. Observe the month of Abib by keeping the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd, at the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. You must not eat it with anything leavened. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, because you came out of the land of Egypt in great haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt. No leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory for 7 days, and none of the meat of what you slaughter on the evening of the first day shall remain until morning. You are not permitted to offer the Passover sacrifice within any of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, but at the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, only there shall you offer the Passover sacrifice, in the evening, at sunset, the time of day when you departed from Egypt. You shall cook it and eat it at the place the Lord your God will choose. The next morning you may go back to your tents. For 6 days you shall continue to eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a solemn assembly for the Lord your God, when you shall do no work. So, as we see, these regulations are only for the first festival. This is longer than the entire text of the whole calendar that we saw in Exodus. And we see clearly here how things have developed. First, we see that a new name is given to the festival. So Passover is not mentioned in Exodus 23, only the feast of the unleavened bread. But here, Passover is defined as the first day of this festival. Further, the regulations are very specific when it comes to the location of the celebration and sacrifices. It's repeated again and again in the text that this must be done in the place God will choose as a dwelling for his name. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the identifying features of the Deuteronomist, so the writer of this law code, and all worship must take place at this centralized location. Notice that this is not present at all in the text of Exodus. So when we look at the regulations for the next festival, which we recall was simply referred to as a festival of harvest in Exodus, we also see a number of these same developments. Here's the text. You shall count 7 weeks. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time the sickle is first put to the standing grain. Then you shall keep the festival of the weeks to the Lord your God, contributing a free will offering in proportion to the blessing that you have received from the Lord your God. Rejoicing before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male and female slaves, the Levites in your towns, as well as the strangers, the orphans, and the widows who are among you, at the place the Lord your God will choose for a dwelling for his name. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt and diligently observe these statutes. Again, we see that these regulations have grown immensely. Exodus simply states that it should be celebrated at the time of the harvest. But here in Deuteronomy, we find the timing is specified as 7 weeks from the time the sickle is put to the standing grain. So the festival is also named the Festival of Weeks because of the counting from the time when one began the grain harvest up to the time when this was to be celebrated. Now further, an offering is prescribed here that wasn't mentioned in Exodus, and again it is made clear that this is only to be celebrated at that one single place God had chosen. Now, we also see a further clarification and specification of the festival, the third festival here in Deuteronomy. You shall keep the festival of booths for 7 days, when you have gathered in the produce from your threshing floor and your winepress. Rejoice during your festival, you and your sons and your daughters and your male and female slaves, as well as the Levites and strangers and orphans and widows resident in your towns. For 7 days you shall keep the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all your undertakings, and you shall surely celebrate. And then we have the closing. So 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the festival of unleavened bread, at the festival of weeks, and the festival of booths. They shall not appear empty-handed. All shall give as they are able, according to the blessings the Lord your God has given to you. So again, this festival receives a new name, the Festival of Booths, and the regulations are made much more specific. Everyone is to celebrate in the place that God has chosen. And again, in the final summary, we see that these 3 festivals are then collected together and named and described as something that must be celebrated at a specific place. So looking again at the overview of festivals here, we see that there was only what was only identified as agricultural festivals in Exodus is in Deuteronomy transformed into named festivals that are to be celebrated at a specific central location. Now, the timing is still related to agricultural realities, but they're also expanded and regulated in a much clearer way than Exodus. So scholars tend to interpret this as the laws being transitioned and practiced in a more urban context, where towns are established, but that the actual celebration of festivals has been centralized to the temple in Jerusalem. In other words, the city folk need a different standard than simply an order to make the offering right after the harvest. And this makes sense because when you're living in a very agricultural reality and the laws are being defined in relation to an agricultural cycle, they are thinking that you're involved in agriculture specifically. But if you remove some of the people from the agricultural realities, then it's not as easy to identify when things are actually happening. So this is a transition we see that's probably based on actual realities that are changing in ancient Israel. Now, let's look at that final law code, this one which is found in Leviticus 23. This one's pretty long, so try and stick with me. Now, these are the appointed festivals for the Lord, the holy convocations, which you shall celebrate at the time appointed for them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, there shall be a Passover offering to the Lord. And on the 15th day of the same month is a festival of unleavened bread for the Lord. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall not work at your occupations. For 7 days you shall present the Lord's offerings by fire. On the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall not work at your occupations. So we see a lot of differences here. First and foremost is the new calendar. Instead of using the older Hebrew calendar, where we find the name Abib, this calendar says simply the first month. Further, the Passover is declared to begin at twilight on the 14th day of the month, with the festival of unleavened bread beginning on the 15th. Here, there's also the requirement of a holy convocation, sort of gathering of people for a worship service, which isn't mentioned in the other texts. Further, the text says that for 7 days people are to make fire offerings. Now note that the ritual has expanded again. Now there are offerings every single day of the festival, and that these are being made by everyone. And then there's assemblies both at the beginning and the end. Now, when we turn to the next section, we find a ritual that's not found in the early texts. So this is related to what we found in Deuteronomy, where it said the time the sickle is first put the standing grain. But this has become a ritualized performance in the text of Leviticus. So the Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land that I am giving you to reap your harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall raise it before the Lord, that you may find acceptance. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall raise it. And on that day, then when you raise the sheaf, you shall offer a lamb 1 year old without a blemish as a burnt offering, and the grain offering, which shall be of 2 ephahs of a choice flour mixed with oil, and an offering of fire pleasing to the Lord. And the drink offering shall be of wine 1/4 of a hin. And you shall eat no bread or parched grain or fresh ears until that very day, until you have brought the offering of your God. It is a statute forever throughout your generations for all your settlements." Now, again, the ritual of raising the grain here provides the anchor for counting the weeks to the Festival of Weeks in Leviticus as well. But this ritual, this priestly activity, which has festival and has offerings connected to it, is not present in any of the other texts. So what we see is a new addition to the prescriptions for the festivals. Now, again, in Deuteronomy, these 7 weeks were counted from the harvesting of the grain. In the Leviticus text, the 7 weeks for the Festival of Weeks are counted then from this actual raising of the grain by the priest. So, and from the day after the Sabbath, from the day in which you bring the sheaf of the elevation offering, you shall count 7 weeks, and they shall be complete. And you shall count from the day after the 7th Sabbath 50 days, and then you shall present an offering of new grain to the Lord. And you bring it from your settlements 2 loaves of bread as an elevation offering, made of 2/10 of an ephah, and they shall be choice flour, baked with leaven, and as first fruits to the Lord. And you shall present the bread with the bread 7 lambs, 1 year old without blemish, 1 young bull, 2 rams, and they shall be a burnt offering to the Lord, along with the grain offering and the drink offerings, an offering made of fire pleasing to the Lord. And then you shall also offer 1 male goat as a sin offering, 2 male lambs, 1 year old, as a sacrifice of well-being. And the priest shall raise them with the bread of the first fruits as an elevation offering before the Lord, together with the 2 lambs. And they shall be holy to the Lord for the priest. On the same day you shall make a proclamation, hold a holy convocation, do no work. This statute will be forever. So, just like the regulations of the Festival of Unleavened Bread, the Festival of Weeks is much more clearly defined in Leviticus. The offerings are spelled out very clearly and include bread, lambs, a bull, 2 rams, as well as a drink offering. So there's bread, there's wine, there's meat. At this point, we're starting to sound like a pretty good meal. And that's exactly what the text says it is, because some of these things are for the priest. This shouldn't surprise us either, because what we're dealing with is called the priestly law. And so it's something that has been developed for the priesthood. And by making regulations that caused people to bring more offerings and better offerings, the priesthood was securing their livelihood. So these regulations are made by priests and benefit the priests. Before we look at the festival booths, let's look quickly at the 2 intervening festivals that aren't in the earlier texts. First, we read, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall observe a day of complete rest, a holy convocation commemorated with trumpet blasts. And you shall not work at your occupations, but present the Lord's offering by fire." Now, this text describes a day which is celebrated with trumpet blasts. And this feast will later, by the time of the Mishnah, have a new name, Rosh Hashanah, the New Year's festival. It seems, of course, a little counterintuitive that the text in our text says that this is the first day of the 7th month. But this reflects a tension in the dating of the festivals that we've already noted and we find throughout the Bible, namely that there are 2 different calendars, well, 3 different calendars actually being used. One that begins in the spring, with the harvest and the Passover and the agricultural calendar, and one that begins later in the 7th month, which is reflected in the new year being celebrated then. Anyway, let's look at the other intervening feast in Leviticus. Now the Lord said to Moses, on the 10th day in the 7th month is the Day of Atonement, and should be a holy convocation. And you shall deny yourselves and present the Lord's offering by fire. Now this is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which is not mentioned either in the earlier law codes, but will come to be one of the most important festivals in the Jewish calendar. So here in Leviticus, we find it for the first time, and we see that it's similar to the other feasts that have been described. There's offerings by fire, people do no work, and this one then comes only a few days after the Festival of the Trumpets that was at the beginning of the 7th month. Now, only a few days later, we have the final festival of the ritual calendar in Leviticus. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of the 7th month, and lasting 7 days, there shall be the festival of booths. The first day is a holy convocation, and you shall not work at your occupations. 7 days you shall present the Lord's offerings by fire, and the 8th day you shall observe a holy convocation, and present the Lord's offerings by fire. It's a solemn assembly, and you shall do no work at your occupations. And these are the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you shall celebrate as times of holy convocation for presenting to the Lord offerings by fire, burnt offerings and grain offerings, sacrifices and drink offerings, each on its proper day, apart from the Sabbaths of the Lord, and apart from your gifts, and apart from all your votive offerings, and apart from all your free will offerings, which you give the Lord." This then continues with the rest of the regulations for the Festival of Booths. And we see that people are supposed to live in booths, and they celebrate this for 7 days. Now, just like the regulations of the festivals for Passover and the Festival of Weeks, we see that there's a clear development here in relation to earlier texts. So where Deuteronomy simply stated that the feast was to be celebrated and that all the people should avoid working, Leviticus goes into detail about the offerings that are to be made and the ways in which they should be celebrated. And of course, we notice that this intervening section here makes it very clear that all of the offerings, all of the sacrifices that are made at all of the festivals come in addition to the regular weekly and monthly offerings that are to be made at the temple. So we see that, again, this kind of priestly idea of we're regulating the income for the priests and for the temple shines through. So what does all this mean? Well, the main point I'm trying to make here is that the Pentateuch actually shows us that the text of the Bible is also being written backwards. We can see this by looking at the particular laws and the way they change between Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. The earliest laws point towards festivals being clearly rooted in agricultural practices and festivals that are very likely related to the other Canaanite cultures surrounding Israel. Now, over time, these practices become more anchored in theology or ideology, as we see in the Deuteronomy texts, where things are moved from the villages to the central location of the temple. Now, the final development is this great priestly concern where, yes, the priests are writing the text, developing and changing the text, and increasing and changing and specifying the requirements to benefit themselves. Now, that is something that I think really shows us the way culture and context changes the Bible within the Bible itself. So it's clearly looking backwards at these earlier texts, but giving them new relevance and new importance depending on their own context and needs. So that is my introduction to the development of biblical law, of the Bible rewriting itself in this case. In the next video, we're going to look at how individual laws within this corpus of biblical law and some of the larger sections also have very clear parallels and may even have direct dependence on earlier law codes. And we're going to use the laws of Hammurabi as our example for that. For now, thanks for watching. This is The Bible Was Written Backwards.